The German women prisoners stood frozen in the Mississippi dawn, their breath visible in the cold March air. A guard had just given them an order that made their hearts stop. "Close your eyes and don't scream." They had heard the whispers. Stories from the Eastern Front about medical experiments, about prisoners strapped to tables, about screams that echoed through concrete walls. Now, standing outside this pristine white building with its red cross painted on the side, they were certain their turn had come. This was it. This was how they would die. But what happened next would shatter everything they believed about their enemy. If this story grabs you, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear will change how you think about war forever. Elizabeth Hoffman stood in the front row, her knuckles white as she clenched her fists. She was 26, but looked 40. 3 years as a field nurse in Germany had carved lines into her face that shouldn't have been there for another decade. She'd seen boys die screaming. She'd held down soldiers while doctors amputated limbs without anesthesia. She thought she knew what horror looked like. She had no idea she was about to learn something far more terrifying than pain. The women had arrived 3 weeks earlier, 60 of them packed into trucks that brought them from the port. They'd been Wehrmacht auxiliaries, radio operators, clerks, nurses, searchlight operators. Not soldiers, but not civilians either. Somewhere in between, which made them valuable enough to capture but not important enough to kill. Or so they hoped. The camp itself had shocked them. Clean barracks, regular meals, guards who didn't beat them. It felt wrong, like a trap waiting to spring. Every kindness seemed designed to lower their guard before the real brutality began. And now, standing outside this medical building, the trap was finally closing. Sergeant Morrison stood before them, a middle-aged American with German ancestry who spoke their language in a thick accent. His face showed nothing. No cruelty, no pity, just bureaucratic indifference as he delivered the command that confirmed their worst fears. "Close your eyes and don't scream." Several women began to cry. One young girl, barely 19, started hyperventilating. Margaret, a 30-year-old secretary from Munich, felt her legs turn to water. They held each other, these former enemies of America, united now only by terror. The prayers started then. Catholic prayers, Protestant prayers, half-remembered words from childhood Sundays that suddenly seemed desperately important. Vater unser im Himmel. The Lord's Prayer in German, whispered by women who hadn't thought about God in years but needed him now more than ever. The door to the medical building swung open. 3 American doctors stepped out wearing clean white coats. They carried black leather bags. Medical bags. The women knew what doctors could do with their knowledge when they chose to inflict pain instead of healing. They'd all heard the rumors about Unit 731 in Japan, about Mengele in the concentration camps, about experiments that turned human beings into laboratory animals. Now, it was their turn. Margaret was called first. She walked toward that white door like a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows. Her friends had to push her gently when she froze at the threshold. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid. The women outside waited. They strained their ears for screams, for sounds of struggle, for anything that would tell them what was happening inside that building. But they heard nothing. Just silence. Terrible, endless silence that stretched their nerves to breaking point. 10 minutes passed. 15. 20. Then the door opened and Margaret walked out. She was alive. Not bleeding. Not crying. Her face showed something the other women couldn't identify at first because it was so unexpected. Confusion. Pure, absolute confusion. She walked past them without speaking, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form words that wouldn't come. What had they done to her? Elizabeth's name was called next. She forced herself to walk steadily, calling on her nurse's training to keep her back straight and her face neutral. She glanced back once at the other women, then stepped inside. The interior made her blink. Clean. Actually clean. The floors were washed and polished. The walls were white without bloodstains. Electric lights, real electric lights, illuminated everything with a brightness that hurt her eyes after years of candlelit German hospitals. 3 examination tables with white sheets, metal cabinets, a desk with organized papers, everything in its place, everything professional. It looked like a hospital. A real hospital, not a torture chamber. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, an older man with gray hair and gentle eyes. Through Sergeant Morrison's translation, he said, "Good morning. I am Dr. Harrison. We are here to perform a medical examination." Elizabeth's mind screamed at her that this was a trick. They would examine her first, find her weaknesses, then exploit them. This gentleness was just preparation for cruelty. Dr. Harrison approached with a stethoscope. The cold metal pressed against her chest through her thin dress. Elizabeth closed her eyes and waited for pain. But there was no pain. Just his calm voice. "Breathe deeply." She did, in and out. He moved the stethoscope to her back. Again. Dr. Chen checked her eyes with a flashlight. Dr. Rodriguez took her temperature. They examined her throat, her ears, her neck glands. Every movement was professional, clinical, careful. And then Dr. Harrison's face changed. His brow furrowed as he listened to her lungs. He moved the stethoscope to different positions on her back, listening intently. His frown deepened. Elizabeth's heart began to race. She knew that expression. She'd worn it herself when examining patients in Germany. It was the face of a doctor who had found something wrong. The 3 doctors conferred in English. Elizabeth couldn't understand their words, but their body language spoke volumes. Something was seriously wrong with her. This was it. Whatever they'd found, tuberculosis, cancer, pneumonia, it would be their excuse to do whatever terrible things they had planned. Dr. Harrison turned back to her. Through the translator he said, "You have fluid in your lungs. It's not severe yet, but it could become serious. You also show signs of malnutrition. Your blood pressure is low. Do you have a cough?" Elizabeth nodded mutely. She'd been coughing for weeks but had ignored it. Everyone coughed in wartime Germany. You didn't complain. You didn't admit weakness. You certainly didn't tell your captors about vulnerabilities. "We are going to treat you," Dr. Harrison said. Elizabeth's mind went blank. Treat her? Enemy doctors were going to treat her. "You will receive antibiotics," he continued. "Medicine to fight the infection in your lungs. Also, vitamin supplements for the malnutrition. Return here every day for a week so we can monitor your progress." Dr. Rodriguez opened a metal cabinet. Inside were rows of medicine bottles, bandages, syringes, all organized and clean. She counted pills into a small paper envelope and handed them to Elizabeth with careful instructions. "Take 1 pill 3 times a day, after every meal. Don't skip doses. The medicine will make you feel better. But you must take all of it, even after you feel better. If you stop too soon, the infection can come back stronger." Elizabeth stared at the envelope in her shaking hands. Real medicine. Antibiotics. In Germany by 1945, such medicine had become rarer than gold. Soldiers died from infections that a few pills could have cured. Children died from diseases that medicine could have prevented. And here, the enemy was giving it to her. A prisoner. A German. Someone who had been part of the machine that tried to destroy them. "You can go now," Dr. Harrison said. "Send in the next woman, and please tell them not to be afraid. We are here to help, not to hurt." Elizabeth walked out in a daze. The morning mist had burned off. Weak sunlight filtered through pine trees. The line of women turned to look at her, their faces tight with fear and questions. She walked past them, still trying to process what had just happened. Margaret appeared at her elbow. "They examined you," Margaret whispered. "They didn't hurt you." Elizabeth shook her head. "No. They found an infection. They gave me medicine." "Medicine?" Margaret's voice rose in disbelief. "Real medicine?" "Antibiotics," Elizabeth said, holding up the paper envelope. "For my lungs." The 2 women stood in silence, looking at each other. Around them, more women emerged from the medical building, each carrying something. Pills, vitamin bottles, cough syrup. One woman had a bandage on her arm where doctors had treated an infected cut. As the morning went on, the fear transformed into something else. Not relief, not yet. Something harder to name. It was cognitive dissonance, the complete inability to reconcile what they'd been told to expect with what was actually happening. They had been told to close their eyes and not scream. They had expected horror. They had prepared for pain. Instead, they received medical care better than what most of them had seen in years. The contrast was so extreme their minds struggled to accept it. But the story was just beginning. What happened over the next few months would force these women to question everything they'd ever believed about their enemy, their country, and themselves. The routine became familiar. Every morning after breakfast, women who needed treatment lined up outside the medical building. The fear that gripped that first morning slowly faded, replaced by something approaching acceptance. Elizabeth returned daily as ordered. Each time, Dr. Harrison or another physician examined her lungs, checked her temperature, asked about her cough. She watched them work with the careful attention of a trained nurse, looking for signs of deception or cruelty. She found none. The doctors maintained detailed records. Each visit was documented, temperatures recorded in neat charts, notes made about symptoms. This level of care was what Elizabeth had been taught in nursing school, but had rarely seen practiced in the chaos of wartime Germany. Here, in a prison camp, American doctors were maintaining standards that German military hospitals had long since abandoned, and the medicine worked. Within days, Elizabeth's cough began to improve. The pain in her chest when she breathed deeply started to fade. She had more energy. She slept better. Her body was healing, perhaps for the first time in years. Other women experienced similar improvements. Greta, a young radio operator with anemia, received iron supplements and extra portions of meat and vegetables. Within 2 weeks, the dark circles under her eyes had faded. Anna, a typist from Berlin with a tooth infection, had the bad tooth extracted by a dentist who treated her with such gentleness she cried afterward, not from pain, but from unexpected kindness. The medical staff also provided preventive care. Vaccinations against diseases common in the American South, treatment for parasites, eye exams and glasses for those who needed them. They even treated minor complaints like athlete's foot and dry skin. One afternoon, Elizabeth found herself alone in the examination room with Dr. Harrison. He was writing notes in her file. She had been practicing her English with the guards and other prisoners. She gathered her courage. "Why?" she asked in halting English. "Why you help us? We are enemy." Dr. Harrison looked up from his notes. His gray eyes met hers. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "You asked why we help you," he said slowly, letting Sergeant Morrison fill in the German translation. "It's a fair question. The answer has several parts. First, there are the Geneva Conventions, international laws about how to treat prisoners of war. We must provide medical care to all prisoners. It's our legal obligation." He paused, then continued. "But the legal answer isn't the full answer. The truth is, I became a doctor to heal people. Not to heal Americans or hurt Germans, just to heal people. When I look at you, I don't see an enemy. I see a patient who needs medical care. That's what medicine is supposed to be." He picked up a small photograph from his desk and handed it to Elizabeth. It showed a young woman in a nurse's uniform, smiling. "This is my daughter Rachel. She's a nurse in France right now, treating wounded soldiers. Some of those soldiers are Germans, enemy soldiers. And I hope with all my heart that when she treats them, she sees patients who need help, not enemies to be hurt." Elizabeth stared at the photograph. The young woman looked about her own age. She thought about German nurses treating American prisoners. Did they show the same care? She wasn't sure. She wanted to believe they did, but honesty forced her to admit she didn't know. Dr. Harrison took the photograph back. "There's one more reason," he said. "Perhaps the most important one. We help you because helping you shows what kind of people we are, what kind of country we are. Wars are fought with weapons, yes, but they're also fought with ideas. The idea of who we are as human beings. If we treat you with cruelty, we become no better than the worst parts of this war. If we treat you with dignity and care, we prove that even in war, humanity can survive." His words hung in the air. Elizabeth didn't fully understand all of them, but she grasped the core meaning. That night in the barracks, Elizabeth shared what Dr. Harrison had told her. The women listened in silence. Some were moved, others remained skeptical, but all of them were forced to confront a painful reality, because letters from Germany continued to arrive, painting a picture of unimaginable suffering. One woman read aloud from her sister in Hamburg. "The hospital where I work has no bandages left. We wash and reuse old ones until they fall apart. We have no morphine for the wounded. They bite on leather straps during surgery. Sometimes they die from the shock of pain. Please, if you have any medicine, send it. Send anything." Another woman shared a letter from her mother in Dresden, which had been firebombed earlier that year. "We live in what used to be a coal cellar. The house above is gone. We have 1 pot, 3 spoons, and the clothes on our backs. We eat potato peels when we can find them. Yesterday, your little brother fainted from hunger. He's only 8 years old, and his ribs show through his skin like a skeleton." The woman reading began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. The guilt was crushing. They were here, safe and fed, while their families suffered. Elizabeth looked down at her own body. She had gained weight since arriving. Her clothes fit tighter. Her face had filled out. She could feel muscle returning to arms that had grown thin during the final years of war. The American food, regular and plentiful, was transforming her body back to health. But every bite felt like a betrayal of her starving family. Every night of peaceful sleep felt like an insult to her mother living in ruins. Every pill she took felt like medicine stolen from German children who needed it more. Elizabeth lay in her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling. She had grown up believing Germany was strong, that the Reich would provide for its people, that loyalty would be rewarded with protection and care. But here she was, an enemy prisoner in a foreign land, receiving better medical care than German citizens were getting in their own country. The cognitive dissonance was painful. Everything she'd been taught was being challenged by simple facts. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. They were kind. The enemy was supposed to be barbaric. They were civilized. The enemy was supposed to hate them. Instead, they healed them. How could both realities exist at the same time? And the transformation had only just begun. The change happened slowly, like ice melting in spring. First, small cracks in the frozen surface of belief. Then larger fractures. Finally, the entire structure of what they'd been taught began to collapse. It started with small observations. The way American soldiers said please and thank you, even when giving orders to prisoners. The way the camp commander ensured the barracks were properly heated before winter came. The way cooks prepared food that was not only nutritious, but actually tasted good. These small acts of basic decency chipped away at the image of Americans as barbaric monsters. Elizabeth found herself thinking more about Dr. Harrison's words, about seeing patients instead of enemies, about humanity surviving even in war. These ideas conflicted sharply with everything Nazi propaganda had taught her. The propaganda had painted Americans as money-obsessed, weak, and decadent, as a mongrel nation with no real culture or strength, as people who would crumble when faced with German military might. But the Americans she encountered bore no resemblance to these propaganda images. They were disciplined, organized, and possessed resources that seemed almost unlimited. Most importantly, they were human in a way the propaganda had denied. She remembered the propaganda films showing Americans as gangsters and criminals, as weak-willed people who cared only about money and pleasure, as a nation that would collapse at the first sign of hardship. But here were Americans who had crossed an ocean to fight a war, who had built prison camps that provided better care than German hospitals, who treated their enemies with a professionalism that spoke of deep organizational strength. How could both versions of America be true? How could the same nation that dropped bombs on German cities also carefully treat a German prisoner's lung infection? The answer, she slowly realized, was that the propaganda had been lies, all of it. Other women in the camp were experiencing similar revelations. In the evenings, small groups gathered in the barracks to talk. These conversations became more honest and more searching as time went on. Greta, the young radio operator, spoke openly one night. I keep thinking about what we were told. That Americans would torture us. That they were beasts, who would treat us worse than animals. But they're not doing that. They're doing the opposite. So what else did they lie to us about? The question fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward. If the propaganda had lied about American treatment of prisoners, what else had been lies? The promised victory that never came. The claims that Germany was winning even as cities burned. The assurances that the Reich would take care of its people. Helga, an older woman who had worked as a clerk in military intelligence, spoke up. I saw the reports. The real reports, not the ones shown to the public. I knew we were losing. I knew about the defeats. But I believed, truly believed, that even in defeat, we would be treated better than this. Better than medicine and clean beds and 3 meals a day. I believed our own propaganda more than the truth I could see with my own eyes. Her words struck at the heart of their collective disillusionment. They had all, to varying degrees, believed in something that turned out to be false. The question was, what to believe now? As weeks turned into months, physical healing brought psychological pain. How could they be healthy when their families were suffering? How could they eat well when letters from home described hunger? The guilt became almost unbearable. Some women stopped eating, pushing away food, even though their bodies needed it. Others became depressed, sitting silent and withdrawn. A few begged to be allowed to return to Germany, even if it meant returning to devastation. The American doctors noticed. Dr. Rodriguez spoke to Elizabeth about it during a checkup. We're seeing signs of what we call survivor's guilt, she explained. It's common among people who survive when others they love don't, or who receive care when their loved ones suffer. You feel guilty for being here, for being safe and well-fed when your family in Germany is struggling. Elizabeth nodded. It was exactly how she felt. I can't tell you not to feel guilty, Dr. Rodriguez continued. That would be pointless. What I can tell you is this. Your suffering won't help your family. If you refuse to eat, you'll become sick again, but your sister in Germany won't become healthier. If you refuse treatment, you'll suffer, but your mother won't suffer less. The best thing you can do for them is to survive, to stay healthy, and to be ready to help them when you can return home. The logic was sound, but emotions don't always follow logic. Still, Dr. Rodriguez's words gave Elizabeth something to hold on to, a reason to accept care without feeling like she was betraying her family. One afternoon, Elizabeth had a conversation with Sergeant Morrison that changed her understanding of everything. They were walking back to the barracks after her medical appointment. Morrison had become friendlier over the months, sometimes sharing stories about his grandmother in Germany. Can I ask you something? Elizabeth said in her improving English. Sure, Morrison replied, pleased she was practicing. The medicine, the food, the care. It costs money, yes? Why America spends this money on prisoners, on enemies? Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. Well, like Dr. Harrison said, there are the Geneva Conventions. We have to follow international law. But you're asking something deeper, I think. Why do we choose to follow these laws when we don't have to? Elizabeth nodded. That was exactly what she was asking. Here's what I think, Morrison said. America is powerful. We have more factories, more resources, more medicine than Germany ever had. We could use that power to destroy, to be cruel, to take revenge for what happened in Europe. Many Americans wanted revenge, especially after they saw what happened in the concentration camps. But choosing to use power for destruction is easy. Any country can do that. Using power to show mercy, to heal instead of hurt. That takes real strength. Moral strength, not just military strength. He paused, letting his words sink in. And here's the other thing. When the war ends, what kind of world do we want? Do we want a world where everyone remembers America as cruel conquerors? Or do we want a world where people remember that even when we were enemies, we treated each other like human beings? The money we spend on medicine now is an investment in the future, a future where maybe, just maybe, we can have peace instead of another war in 20 years. My son is 15 years old. I don't want him to have to fight in another war. So maybe if we treat you well now, your children and my son can live in peace later. His words struck Elizabeth deeply. This wasn't about weakness or softness. This was strategic thinking on a level she'd never considered. The Americans weren't being kind because they were naive. They were being kind because they understood something fundamental about power and peace. Power through mercy. It was a concept German propaganda had never taught. In the Nazi worldview, power came from strength, from domination, from the willingness to be ruthless. The idea that showing mercy could also be a demonstration of power was foreign to everything she'd learned. But she couldn't deny the truth of it. The Americans were powerful precisely because they could afford to be merciful. They didn't need to be cruel because they were secure in their strength. Germany, by contrast, had been cruel because it was weak. Its cruelty had been born of fear and desperation, not confidence. This realization was painful because it forced her to acknowledge how thoroughly she'd been deceived. The Reich had promised strength, but delivered weakness. It had promised victory, but brought defeat. It had promised to protect its people, but left them to starve while enemy prisoners ate well in American camps. The ideology she'd believed in, the system she'd served, had failed at every level. And the enemy she'd been taught to hate was demonstrating values, mercy, human dignity, that her own nation had abandoned. But the final break was yet to come. The complete break came in May 1945, 3 months after that first terrifying morning outside the medical building. Word reached the camp that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Reich had fallen. The women gathered in the barracks that evening, processing the news in stunned silence. Everything they had fought for, worked for, believed in, had come to an end. Not with the glorious victory they'd been promised, but with total defeat and unconditional surrender. Elizabeth sat on her bunk, holding a letter from her mother in Hamburg. It described conditions after the British bombing raids. No water, no electricity, no food. People living in cellars, emerging only to search for anything edible. The old and young dying from disease and malnutrition. She looked down at her own hands. Clean hands, strong hands. Hands that belonged to a body that was healthy and well-fed. She thought about the medicine that had cured her lung infection, the vitamins that had restored her strength, the food that had put weight back on her bones, all provided by the enemy while her own nation let its people starve. Something broke inside her, not her spirit. Rather, the last walls of denial finally crumbled. She could no longer pretend, could no longer make excuses, could no longer believe that Germany had been right and the Allies wrong. She thought back to that first morning. Close your eyes and don't scream. They had expected horror. They had been prepared for the worst, and instead, they had received something that was, in its own way, more devastating than any torture could have been. They had received kindness from those they'd been taught to see as monsters. That night, the women talked until the early hours of morning. Not in whispers this time, but in open conversation. The need to maintain loyalty to a defeated regime had disappeared. "We were lied to," one woman said. "About everything." "Yes," another agreed. "But we also lied to ourselves. I saw signs that we were losing. I saw the cruelty. I saw the mistakes. But I didn't want to believe it. So I didn't." Greta spoke up, her young voice clear in the darkness. "The doctors here treated us better than our own country treated its own people. That's the truth we have to face. The enemy showed us more humanity than the regime we served." Elizabeth added her own thoughts. "I was a nurse. I took an oath to heal people. But in Germany toward the end, there was no healing. Only suffering. Only death. Here, I've watched enemy doctors do what I couldn't do in my own country. They healed us. They showed us what medicine is supposed to be." The recognition was collective, but also deeply personal for each woman. They were acknowledging not just the failure of the Nazi regime, but their own complicity in it. They had worked for the military machine. They had believed the propaganda, or at least hadn't questioned it loudly enough. They had been part of the system, even if they weren't the ones making the big decisions. That acknowledgement was painful, but it was also necessary. Only by facing the truth of what had been could they begin to think about what could be in the future. The months that followed Germany's surrender were filled with uncertainty. The women waited for news about when they would be allowed to return home. The prospect of returning was both longed for and dreaded in equal measure. They wanted to see their families, to reunite with loved ones, to know who had survived and who had not, but they also feared what they would find. Letters painted an increasingly grim picture. The country was in ruins, food was scarce, infrastructure had collapsed, and there was another fear, one some women were embarrassed to admit even to themselves. They had grown used to regular meals, to medical care, to safety and stability. They had clean beds, warm barracks, sufficient food, and doctors who treated them with respect. Returning to Germany meant returning to chaos and deprivation. How could they dread returning to their own country? How could they feel reluctant to leave their captivity? What kind of Germans were they if they preferred being prisoners in America to being free in Germany? But the feelings were there whether they wanted them or not. Elizabeth wrote in a journal she'd started keeping, "I feel like two different people. Part of me is still Elizabeth Hoffman, the German nurse from Hamburg who wants nothing more than to go home. But another part of me has changed. I've seen what a country at peace looks like. I've seen what it means to have enough. Enough food, enough medicine, enough of everything. I've seen how enemies can treat each other with dignity. How can I go back to Germany without carrying these memories with me? And what will I do with them when I get there?" In October 1945, 7 months after that first terrifying morning, Dr. Harrison called Elizabeth into the medical building for one last examination. The women were finally being repatriated. Ships would take them back to Europe within 2 weeks. Dr. Harrison conducted a thorough examination just as he'd done so many times before. When he finished, he sat back and smiled. "Your lungs are completely clear. No sign of infection. Your weight is healthy. Your blood pressure is normal. From a medical standpoint, you're in excellent health." Elizabeth felt a surge of emotion. She had arrived at this camp sick and weak. Now she was leaving healthy and strong. The difference was entirely due to the care she'd received here. "Thank you," she said in English. "Thank you for everything." Dr. Harrison nodded. "You're welcome. But Elizabeth, I want to tell you something before you leave. You were a nurse in Germany. You understand medicine. You know what it means to heal people. When you return home, Germany is going to need nurses desperately. They'll need people who understand not just how to treat illness, but how to treat patients with dignity and care. I hope you'll use what you've learned here. Not just the medical knowledge, but the understanding that every patient, regardless of who they are, deserves to be treated as a human being." His words struck deep. He wasn't just talking about medicine. He was talking about the bigger lesson of her time in this camp, about humanity, about how people should treat each other even when they're enemies, about the power of mercy and the importance of dignity. "I will remember," Elizabeth promised. "I will never forget what you did for us here." The ship that carried them back to Europe was very different from the one that had brought them to America. They traveled as repatriated prisoners, not as defeated soldiers being shipped to an unknown fate. They knew what awaited them: devastation, hunger, and the massive task of rebuilding. But they also carried something unexpected. They carried memories of how enemies had treated them with kindness. They carried the knowledge that even in war, humanity could survive. They carried the understanding that mercy could be a form of strength rather than weakness. These were lessons that Germany would desperately need in the years to come. Elizabeth stood on the deck as the ship approached the German coast. The same coast she'd left 8 months earlier. But she wasn't the same person who had left. That person had been shaped entirely by Nazi propaganda and wartime fear. This person had been transformed by unexpected kindness from unexpected sources. She thought about that first morning outside the medical building. "Close your eyes, and don't scream." They had closed their eyes expecting horror. Instead, they had opened them to a revelation about what human beings could be, even to their enemies. The war had ended. But the lessons learned in Camp Clinton would stay with her for the rest of her life. And she would pass them on to others, helping to build a new Germany that had learned something essential from its defeat. That civilization requires not just strength, but the wisdom to use that strength with compassion. Years later, Elizabeth would tell her children and grandchildren about her time as a prisoner of war in America. She would tell them about the fear she felt that first morning outside the medical building, about the command to close their eyes and not scream, about expecting torture and receiving healing instead. She would tell them about Dr. Harrison and his belief that even enemies deserve to be treated as human beings, about how American doctors gave her medicine that saved her life while German civilians went without, about learning that true strength meant having the power to destroy but choosing instead to heal. Most importantly, she would tell them that the greatest weapon in that war wasn't bombs or bullets, but the simple act of treating prisoners with dignity and care. Because that kindness broke through hatred in a way that cruelty never could. It forced the prisoners to see their enemies as human. And once you see someone as human, everything changes. The antibiotics that cured her lung infection became more than just medicine. They became proof that enemies can show mercy. The clean hospital became more than just a building. It became evidence that civilization can survive even in war. The professional care from doctors became more than treatment. It became a lesson about human dignity that would shape her for the rest of her life. For Elizabeth and the other German women prisoners at Camp Clinton, the command to close their eyes and not scream became the moment before a revelation. They closed their eyes expecting the worst of humanity. They opened them to discover the best. And that made all the difference. This is the story that deserves to be remembered. A story about how mercy can be more powerful than revenge. About how treating enemies with humanity can change the world. About how sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't violence. It's choosing compassion when you have every reason to choose cruelty. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about war and humanity, and what it means to be truly strong, then hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you true stories from history that reveal the incredible complexity of human nature during our darkest hours. Stories that remind us what we're capable of, both at our worst and at our best. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe now, because these stories aren't just about the past. They're about who we choose to be today.